One evening in Palermo, an unnamed waitress, a newly crowned mob boss, and a burst of gunfire shatters the summer night, turning the coldest man in Sicily into a bullet shield for a woman whose name he doesn't even know. This is an unexpected moment, and it will draw two people into a battle with no escape. If you're watching this video, please like and comment the name of the city you're watching, so I can see how far this story has come. Don't turn off the video, because the ending will leave you breathless. The night Mirella Vale nearly died, she was thinking about bread, not about the table of drunk tourists at the far end of the terrace who'd been snapping their fingers at her for 20 minutes. Not about the old fisherman at table 9 who kept refilling his wine glass before she could reach him. Not about the damp heat pressing down on Palermo like a wool blanket soaked in salt air, or the fact that her left shoe had developed a blister-raising seam that had been chewing into her heels since the 6 o'clock rush. She was thinking about the bread her mother used to make on Sunday mornings, the kind with rosemary and sea salt pressed into the crust, the kind that made the whole apartment smell like something worth coming home to. She was thinking about that bread when the tarantella started. The old musician in the corner, Salvatore, 72, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an accident he never fully explained, he hit the opening notes on his guitar, and something happened to Mirella's body that her brain had no part in. Her hips shifted. Her feet found the rhythm without asking permission. She was carrying a full tray of antipasto and a carafe of house red, and she should have kept walking, kept her head down, kept the invisible line between server and background firmly intact. She didn't. She spun. One full rotation, tray balanced on her upturned palm like it weighed nothing, the hanging lanterns above the terrace catching her hair as it fanned out around her. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Her eyes closed, her chin lifted, and for that fraction of a moment she wasn't a 24-year-old waitress in borrowed shoes with 40 euros in her checking account. She was something else entirely. The terrace erupted, clapping, laughter, a few whistles from the tourist tables. Salvatore grinned so wide his gold tooth caught the light, and he launched into the next verse with renewed energy, nodding at Mirella like she'd just done him a personal favor. She laughed. A real laugh. The unguarded kind she almost never let out in public, and dipped into a mocking little curtsy before continuing toward table 9 with the antipasto. She didn't see the man in the corner booth. She wouldn't have recognized him if she had. Lucien De Luca had not been photographed publicly in 4 years. The trial that had threatened to expose everything had collapsed. 3 witnesses recanted on the same morning, which anyone paying attention understood was not coincidence. And afterward, Lucien had become a rumor more than a man. A name spoken carefully in certain circles, a presence implied rather than confirmed. His father, Enzo De Luca, had built the syndicate on spectacle and violence, had let himself be known, had believed visibility was power. His son believed the opposite. Lucien De Luca believed you should never be seen at all. He sat with his back to the stone wall and a glass of mineral water untouched in front of him. He did not eat. He rarely ate in public. His second-in-command, a man named Carlo, who had the build of a shipping container and the face of someone who had absorbed a great deal of punishment over the years, sat across from him pretending to read the menu. There were 2 more men at the bar inside, angled toward the terrace entrance. A 5th in a car parked on the street who had been watching the alley behind the restaurant for the past hour. Lucien had not requested this level of security. It had been imposed on him. 3 weeks ago, a rival from Catania named Matteo Moretti had announced, not through any official channel, but through the language that men like them used, through the carefully placed message, through the body left where it was meant to be found, that he intended to challenge the De Luca supremacy over the southern routes. Moretti was new money built on old brutality. He had consolidated 3 smaller operations in 18 months, and he was hungry in the way that men who had once had nothing tended to be hungry, without restraint, without ceiling, without the patience that separates ambition from recklessness. Lucien understood him completely. He had been that man once, a long time ago. He had come to the trattoria for a quiet meeting with a port official who owed him 3 conversations worth of information. The official was late. Lucien was not surprised. The man had been late to every meeting they'd had, and Lucien had long since decided this was a nervous habit rather than a power play, because the port official had no leverage with which to play power games and knew it. So Lucian sat. He watched the terrace. He was thinking about the logistics of a container shipment that needed to clear the docks without inspection when the music started. He looked up. He watched the girl spin. Something in his chest moved. Not dramatically, not with the force of anything he could have named in the moment. It was smaller than that, more like a shift in pressure, the way a room feels different when someone opens a window. He watched her laugh and drop into that ridiculous little curtsy and continue walking like she hadn't just stopped 30 people mid-conversation with nothing but 3 seconds of instinct and a borrowed tray. He watched her move through the tables. Efficient, but not robotic. She apologized to the man at table 9 for the wait, with a tone that managed to be genuinely sorry without being servile. She handled the drunk tourist table with a kind of practiced patience that had clearly been earned rather than taught. The patience of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that anger was expensive and smiling was cheaper. He noticed the shoe, the slight favoring of her left foot. He noticed the way she paused beside the kitchen door and rolled her neck once, quickly, like she was trying to shake off something that had settled between her shoulder blades. He noticed the sadness, not in any obvious way. She smiled constantly, and most of the smiles were real, or real enough. But there was something underneath them, something she was carrying that had nothing to do with the antipasto tray. He looked away. Carlo was saying something about the port official, about whether they should wait another 20 minutes or reschedule, and Lucian was about to respond when the front doors of the restaurant blew open. Not opened. Blew open. The sound arrived a half-second before his brain processed what was happening. A crack of wood, a rush of cold air cutting through the heat, and then the unmistakable, irreversible percussion of automatic gunfire opening up from the doorway into the crowded terrace. Everything became simple. This was the thing about violence. Real violence, not the managed, deliberate kind he directed, but the sudden, chaotic kind directed at him. It stripped everything down to mechanics. His body moved before his mind caught up. He was out of the booth. He was crossing the terrace in 3 strides. He saw Morella standing frozen between table 7 and the kitchen door with a carafe of wine in her hand, and her eyes wide and her mouth open, but no sound coming out yet, because the sound takes a moment to catch up too. He hit her low and hard, wrapping one arm around her waist and pulling her down behind the nearest stone planter as a burst of fire tore through the hanging lanterns above them. Glass rained down. Someone screamed, a high, piercing scream that cut through everything else, and then was swallowed by more gunfire. The carafe shattered somewhere to their left. Lucien pressed Morella flat against the stone floor with his weight across her shoulders and felt her gasp against the tiles, felt her whole body shaking beneath him. Carlo had drawn his weapon. The men from the bar were moving. It was over in under a minute. It was always over faster than it felt. And then there was silence of a different quality, the silence that follows gunfire, thick with smoke, and the smell of something burnt, and the sound of people crying who hadn't been hit but couldn't fully process that yet. Lucian lifted his weight off Morella, and she pushed herself up onto her hands and stared at him. Up close she was. He didn't let himself finish the thought. Her lip was bleeding from where it had hit the tile. Her eyes were dark brown, and at this moment very wide and cycling rapidly through a series of emotions that he recognized in order. Terror, confusion, animal alertness, and then something slower and harder to name, something that happened when you looked directly at a stranger who had just decided, without any apparent deliberation, that you were worth covering with his body. "Can you stand?" he said. She stared at him. "I need to know if you're hurt." She looked down at herself. Her hands were shaking visibly. Her uniform had a smear of blood on the left sleeve. Not hers, he assessed quickly. Wrong position, likely from the floor. She stopped. Tried again. "I don't think so." "Get up. Stay behind me." The terrace was devastation. 3 of the shooters were down. A 4th had been taken alive by Carlo's men. Taken was a euphemism. The man was conscious, but not in any meaningful way, slumped against the outside wall with his wrists pinned and Carlo crouching in front of him with an expression that promised the next few minutes would be instructive. 2 restaurant staff were injured. A tourist at the nearest table had taken a ricochet across his forearm. He was sitting very still and staring at his own blood with the expression of a man whose mind had not yet agreed to process what his eyes were showing him. Salvatore the musician was unhurt, sitting in his chair with his guitar still in his hands, which Lucien found obscurely remarkable. Mirella was standing beside him, shaking. She had not run. He had told her to stay behind him, and she had stayed. He wasn't sure whether that was courage or shock. He turned to Carlo, who approached and crouched to speak quietly. "Moretti's people," Carlo said. Not a question. Obviously. "The survivors talking." Carlo's voice was professionally neutral, which meant the information was bad. "He says the order wasn't specifically for you tonight. It was general, hit the restaurant, create chaos. But the secondary objective—" Carlo paused. He glanced at Mirella, standing 3 feet away, still shaking. Lucien looked at her too. "She's compromised," Carlo said quietly. "They saw you cover her. Word's already moving. Moretti will know by morning that you exposed yourself to protect a civilian. He'll treat it as an opening." Lucien was quiet for a moment. Around them, the survivors were being sorted, his men managing the scene with the efficiency of people who had done this before, which they had. Sirens somewhere in the distance, still far enough away to matter. "Get the cars," Lucien said. Carlo hesitated, just a fraction. "Her too?" Lucien looked at Mirella again. She was looking back at him. The shaking in her hands had slowed, but not stopped. Her bottom lip had a thin line of dried blood from the cut. She still had her work apron on, strings dangling at her hip, a small notebook tucked in the front pocket. She looked like exactly what she was. A girl who had been having an ordinary shift and would never be able to return to it now because of a 3-second spin under hanging lights and the bad luck of being noticed by the wrong person in the worst possible way. Except he hadn't been the wrong person to notice her. Moretti was. Moretti's people, wherever they were, had already catalogued her, had already made her into a variable in someone's calculation. "Her too," Lucien said. Mirella had heard. She took a step back. I don't know who you are, and I'm not going anywhere with—" "My name is Lucien De Luca," he said. He kept his voice even. "You've heard of the De Luca family." He watched her face. She'd heard. Everyone in Palermo had heard. The specific quality of stillness that came over her. The kind where a person stops breathing for just a moment while their brain rewrites the past hour, told him she understood what that name meant. "The men who came in tonight work for someone who now believes I care about keeping you alive," Lucien continued. "Whether or not that's true doesn't matter. What matters is that he believes it. That makes you a target. Tonight. Tomorrow. However long it takes him to move." She looked past him at the ruined terrace, at Salvatore still sitting in his chair, eyes closed now, at the shattered lanterns and the overturned tables and the tourist with the arm wound being helped toward the door by one of Lucien's men. "What happens if I say no?" she asked. "Then I leave you here and you take your chances." He paused. "I would not recommend it." She looked at him for a long time. Her jaw was set in a way that told him she was angry. Good. Anger was useful. Anger was better than the frozen kind of fear that made people useless. And then she looked down at her apron strings and untied them with quick, deliberate movements and said, "I need my bag. It's in the back." "You have 2 minutes." She walked toward the kitchen without looking back at him, shoulders straight, that slight favoring of her left foot still there. And Lucien watched her go and then turned back to Carlo, who was watching him with an expression that was studiously, professionally blank. "Don't," Lucien said. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." Carlo looked at the kitchen door. "The villa outside the city," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." The sirens were closer now. Time was compressing. Lucien looked once more at the spot on the terrace where the lanterns had been. The hook still hanging there above nothing, and then he walked toward the waiting cars. She came back in under 2 minutes. Canvas bag over her shoulder, jacket over her arm, face wiped clean of expression in the way that people learn to do when they need to get through something without falling apart inside it. She had changed out of the work apron. She was wearing the same shoes. She looked at the car. She looked at him. She got in. The convoy pulled out of the alley behind the restaurant and moved north through the city, and Mirella sat in the back seat beside Lucien and stared out the window at the Palermo streets going past and said nothing. He said nothing either. The city thinned as they moved toward the coast. The lights grew sparser. The smell of salt water replaced the exhaust and night food smells of the Centro. After a long time, she said, without looking at him, "I had a full section tonight. Best tips of the week." He didn't respond. "I'm just saying," she said. "Worst possible night for this." He looked at her profile in the dark of the car, the cut on her lip, the set of her jaw. The fingers of her right hand pressed flat against her thigh, still working through the shaking she was trying not to show. "There's never a good night for this," he said. She turned and looked at him then, and for a moment in the dark of the moving car, with the lights of Palermo falling away behind them and the coast road opening up ahead, something passed between them that neither of them had any language for, and neither of them tried to name. Then she looked away again. The villa was 2 hours north. By the time they turned off the coast road and through the iron gates, it was past midnight. The Mediterranean was a black and silver nothing beyond the olive trees. The air was cooler here, cleaner, with a weight to it that felt less like summer and more like something older. Carlo showed Mirella to a room on the second floor. Lucien stood on the terrace and looked at the water and did not sleep. At 4 a.m, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, which meant it was a number that had been designed to reach him through channels that couldn't be traced back to anything. He answered. The voice on the other end was calm and slightly amused in the way of a man who had spent enough time winning to enjoy the architecture of confrontation. "Lucien," Matteo Moretti said. "I heard about the trouble at the restaurant tonight. Terrible thing, random violence like that." Lucien said nothing. "I also heard," Moretti continued, "that you covered a waitress with your own body, a nobody, a girl who spins around for tips." A pause. "I've been trying to find a weakness in the De Luca wall for 6 months, and you just handed me one." Lucien's hand on the phone was very still. "Bring her to me by Friday," Moretti said, "and we discuss terms. Refuse, and I find her myself. You know how my people work when they have to find someone themselves." The line went dead. Below the terrace, the olive trees moved in the coastal wind. Above the villa's second floor, a light was on in Mirella's window. She wasn't sleeping either. Lucien put the phone in his pocket and looked at the water and understood that by answering an instinct he hadn't felt in years, by throwing his body across a stranger on a restaurant floor without stopping to calculate the cost, he had just started a war with no clean way out. And the girl at the center of it had no idea. Not yet. She was awake before the sun came up. Mirella lay on the bed in the villa's second-floor room with her shoes still on and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house. Footsteps below. Low voices that stopped when they got close to a certain register, the register of things being discussed that she was not supposed to hear. The sea somewhere beyond the windows, constant and indifferent. A door opening and closing twice in the hour before dawn. She hadn't slept. She wasn't going to pretend she had. The room was not a cell. That was the first thing she'd cataloged when Carlo had shown her to it. The lock was on the inside, not the outside. The window looked over the olive grove and beyond that the coast road, and while there were men stationed at the gate and at least 2 she'd spotted walking the perimeter in the dark, nobody had told her she couldn't leave. They hadn't needed to. Moretti's people were out there somewhere in the direction of Palermo, and the only thing standing between her and whatever Moretti's people did to women who'd been categorized as leverage was the man sleeping, or not sleeping, somewhere else in this house. She sat up, looked at her bag on the floor. She had her phone, 43 euros, her work ID, a lip balm, and half a granola bar she'd been saving for the walk home that she now would not be taking. She had the clothes on her back. She had her shoes with the bad seam on the left one, which had now fully opened up and left a raw stripe across her heel that stung every time she shifted her weight. She stood up, pulled off the shoe, looked at the damage, dug through her bag for the small roll of medical tape she kept there. Occupational habit, a waitress's feet were a waitress's primary tool, and wrapped her heel with the mechanical focus of someone who needed something to do with her hands. Then she sat back down and let the shaking come. It came in waves. It had been doing that since the restaurant, holding off when she needed to function, returning when she stopped. Her hands first, then her jaw, then a deep interior trembling that had nothing to do with cold. She pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed through it, and told herself the things she knew to be factually true. She was alive. She was unhurt. She was in a building with walls. She was not in Moretti's hands. She was in Lucien de Luca's hands, which, depending on who you asked, was a distinction without a meaningful difference, except he had covered her with his body on that restaurant floor without a second's hesitation. She was still thinking about that when the light under the door moved and there was a knock. 3 short raps, no announcement, and before she could answer, the door opened and a woman she hadn't seen before came in carrying a tray with coffee and bread and a small bowl of oil. 50s, compact, gray hair pulled back hard, the face of someone who had been in close proximity to difficult men for long enough that nothing much surprised her anymore. She set the tray on the table by the window without looking directly at Morella and said, in Sicilian dialect thicker than the coffee, "He wants you downstairs when you're ready." "Who are you?" Morella asked. "Agata. I keep the house." "Does the house need a lot of keeping?" Agata looked at her then. A brief assessment, the kind that took full inventory in under 3 seconds. "Eat first," she said, and left. Morella drank the coffee standing up. It was very good coffee. That felt important somehow. The specific cruelty of very good coffee on a morning like this. She ate half the bread, dipped in the oil, and tasted almost nothing. Then she went downstairs. Lucien was in the main room. He was on a call, standing with his back to the door, looking out through the glass toward the olive grove. He was still wearing the same clothes as last night, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, the back of it slightly creased from what she guessed had been a few hours on a couch rather than a bed. He held up one finger without turning around, which she interpreted as wait, and she stood in the doorway and waited. His voice on the phone was different than it had been in the car, lower, flatter, the kind of voice that had learned to give orders without inflection, because inflection implied the possibility of argument. "I said by morning," he said. "It's morning." A pause. "Then find someone who can." He ended the call and turned around. He looked at her face, then at the taped heel visible above her shoe. He didn't comment on either. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." A beat. He didn't push it. He pulled a chair out from the table and sat down himself, which she hadn't expected, and looked up at her with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and not quite achieving it. "I need to tell you something," he said. "That's usually how bad news starts. Moretti called me last night, after we arrived." She felt the coffee turn in her stomach. "What did he say?" Lucien told her. All of it, without softening anything, which she found she appreciated even as the information itself landed like something physical. The specific words, "Bring her to me by Friday, find her myself, you know how my people work." She stood very still while he talked, and when he finished, she stood still for another few seconds before she said, "How many days is that?" 4. "And you're not going to give me to him?" It wasn't quite a question. He looked at her steadily. "No." "Because you've decided I'm worth protecting, or because giving me to him means conceding ground?" The question hung in the air between them. She watched him consider it, genuinely consider it, not just manufacture an answer. And then he said, "Both. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She nodded slowly. She hadn't expected honesty. It recalibrated something. "So what happens now?" "You stay here. My men maintain the perimeter. I work on Moretti." "Work on him how?" "That's not your concern." "I'm the reason you're in this position. That makes it my concern." His jaw tightened fractionally. "You're in this position because Moretti decided to make you leverage. That's on him, not you." That's a very clean way to think about it. It's the accurate way. Carlo appeared in the doorway behind her. She hadn't heard him coming. He had that quality. Large men sometimes did. Men who had spent enough time in violent situations to learn how to move through space without announcing themselves. He looked at Lucien over Morella's head with an expression that communicated something she wasn't meant to read. "Give us a minute," Lucien said. Morella turned. Carlo was looking at her now. And the expression wasn't hostile exactly, but it was assessing in a way that made her feel like a variable in an equation being solved. She held his gaze until he looked back at Lucien and stepped out of the doorway. She turned back to Lucien. Your man doesn't trust me. Carlo doesn't trust anyone. It's a professional requirement. Does he trust you? Something moved across Lucien's face. Not quite a smile. Not quite anything she had a name for. Mostly, he said. She looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in the car or the chaos of the restaurant. He was younger than she'd imagined when she'd heard the name. The De Luca family in Palermo Street conversation was a mythology more than a reality, and mythologies tended to accumulate age. He couldn't be more than mid-30s. There were lines around his eyes that weren't from laughter, and a tension in his jaw that looked structural rather than situational, the kind that came from years of holding something in rather than from the specific pressures of this morning. His hands on the table were still. I want to call my mother, she said. No calls out. Not yet. She'll worry. Carlo will have someone deliver a message through a clean line. Tell me what to say. She thought about it. Her mother lived in Cefalù, an hour east. 58 years old, bad hip, worked the early shift at a bakery that still used a wood-fired oven. The kind of woman who watched the news every morning with the specific alertness of someone who had always expected the world to deliver bad news eventually and wanted to be ready for it. The kind of woman who had raised Morella alone after her father left when Morella was 9, who had worked doubles and never complained, who had said when Morella took the waitressing job in Palermo, "Be careful, there are people in that city who collect things, and they don't give them back." Tell her I'm visiting a friend on the coast, Morella said. Tell her I forgot to charge my phone. Tell her I'll call in a few days. She'll believe that? She'll pretend to. It's what we do. Carlo was back in the doorway. Lucienne stood, which was the end of the conversation whether she was finished or not, and said, Stay inside the house. Agatha will get you anything you need. There's a library on the east side if you want something to do. A library, she said flatly. Books, he confirmed, with the complete seriousness of a man who had never once considered that the presence of a library might not resolve a hostage situation. He left with Carlo. She stood alone in the main room and listened to their voices recede down the corridor. The library had 200 books, most of them in Italian, some in French, a few in English. She chose one in Italian, something thick and old about the history of the Sicilian landscape, and she read 4 pages and understood none of them, and then set it down and watched the olive grove for an hour instead. Outside, Lucien's men moved at intervals. Professional, contained, never gathering in groups of more than 2. The perimeter was serious. She tried to imagine what it cost to maintain this, the logistics of men and vehicles, and the specific silence that surrounded power in its most concentrated form, and found she couldn't fully construct the scale of it. It was like trying to imagine the depth of the sea from its surface. The morning passed in a constrained, abrading way that she suspected was characteristic of this kind of situation. She ate lunch alone in the kitchen. Agatha moved around her without conversation, which Morella decided to find neutral rather than hostile. In the early afternoon, she heard raised voices from somewhere in the back of the house. 2 men, not Lucien, the kind of argument conducted in the specific half-volume of people who are furious but aware of the need for discretion. She edged into the corridor, couldn't make out words, just tone. Accusatory, defensive, the rhythmic percussion of men who had been holding something in long enough that it had started to come out sideways. Then a door opened and a man she didn't recognize came out moving fast, nearly walked into her, and stopped. He was young, close to her age, maybe younger, with dark eyes and a split lip that was a day or 2 old, and the look of someone who had recently been on the wrong side of a decision. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, and then looked past her toward the front of the house and moved on without speaking. Carlo appeared in the doorway the man had come from. He looked at her standing in the corridor with her arms folded and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You shouldn't be back here." I heard voices. "The house makes noise." That wasn't the house. Carlo regarded her. He had the stillness of someone who spent a great deal of energy maintaining surfaces. "Go back to the front rooms," he said. "Please." The please was added with the specific tone of a man who had been told to be more careful with civilians and found the instruction professionally degrading. She went back, but she kept thinking about the young man with the split lip and the expression she hadn't been able to name. By evening, she had named it. It was the expression of someone who had done something they couldn't undo and were still deciding whether to feel relieved or terrified about it. Lucien came back to the main room at 7. He had changed his shirt, and he had the focused emptiness of a man who had spent several hours doing things that required him to be somewhere other than himself. He sat across from her at the table where she'd set up with the landscape book she still wasn't reading and said, without preamble, "How are you holding up?" "It wasn't really a question," she said. "It was." She considered him. "I'm holding up like someone who went to work yesterday and came home to a war. How are you holding up?" Something shifted in his face. "Not much. Enough." "I've been in this situation before," he said. "Being hunted?" "Managing threats." "Is that what I am? A threat to manage?" "You know what I meant." "I know what you said." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize. Something caught between irritation and something else. Something slower. Something he was clearly not accustomed to feeling in proximity to a problem he was trying to solve. He said, "There's a development." She waited. "One of my men was approached this morning, before we left the city." He paused with the precision of someone choosing exactly where to put weight. Someone from Moretti's organization offered him a significant amount of money for information about this location. The room felt different suddenly, smaller. "Did he take it?" "He's been with my family for 8 years. That's not what I asked." Lucien's eyes on her were very still. "No," he said. "He didn't take it. He reported it to Carlo within the hour." "The man with the split lip?" A beat. "You saw him?" "I was in the corridor." "What happened to his lip?" "That's not—" "What happened to his lip, Lucien?" The use of his name, the first time she'd used it, direct and without deference, landed visibly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He was approached in the city while running an errand he shouldn't have been running alone. Moretti's contact got close enough to make the offer and make a point about what refusal would mean for people he cares about. The lip is from that conversation." She absorbed this. "He has people Moretti can threaten. A sister in Palermo. Moretti's man knew her name, her address, her schedule." Lucien's voice was level, but there was something beneath it. Not anger exactly, something more like the concentrated weight of a man who was very tired of the specific arithmetic of other people's safety being used as currency. "It's a standard tactic." "It's what he's doing with me," she said. "Yes." She looked down at the open book in front of her, at the photograph of the Sicilian coast taken from some clifftop decades ago, the sea bright and indifferent in black and white. "The man who approached your— what's his name?" "Luca." "The man who approached Luca. He knows we're somewhere on the coast north of the city. It's a significant stretch of coastline. But it narrows it." Lucien didn't respond, which was its own response. "You're thinking about moving me," she said. "I'm thinking about options." "What are the options?" Don't tell me it's not my concern. If it's about where I sleep and whether I'm alive in the morning, it's my concern." She kept her voice even. She had found in the past 20 hours that evenness was the thing she could control when everything else was beyond her reach, and she held on to it the way you held on to the one solid thing in moving water. "Tell me the options." He looked at her for a long moment. She had the sense of something being recalibrated. Then he said, "We stay and reinforce. We move and risk being tracked in transit, or we accelerate the timeline on dealing with Moretti directly." "Accelerate how?" "That's not something I can discuss with you. Can't or won't?" "Both." He stood. "I have calls to make." "You always have calls to make." He paused at the door, didn't turn around. "You're handling this better than most people would." "I'm not handling it," she said. "I'm enduring it. There's a difference." He left. That night she couldn't sleep again, but this time it was different. Not the shaking, reactive sleeplessness of the night before, but something more active, her mind moving through the architecture of what she knew and what she didn't and the spaces between. She lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about her mother, and about the restaurant, and about Salvatore still sitting in his chair after the gunfire with his guitar in his lap and his eyes closed, and about the way Lucien had said, "Bring her to me by Friday," with the flatness of someone repeating a sentence they were still deciding how to answer. She thought about the split-lipped young man named Luca and the sister in Palermo, whose name and address Moretti's people had acquired. She thought about how many other people in this house had sisters. At 2 in the morning, she got up and padded down the corridor to the kitchen for water, and found Lucien already there, sitting at the table with a glass of something he wasn't drinking and a phone face down in front of him. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. She got a glass from the cabinet, filled it from the tap, drank half of it standing at the sink. Her feet were bare. The tile was cool. Outside the kitchen window, the olive grove was a mass of shadows moving in the coastal wind. "You don't sleep," she said. "Not much." "How long has it been like that?" He considered the question. "A while." She turned and leaned against the sink with the glass in her hand and looked at him. In the kitchen light, without the managed distance of daylight and strategy, he looked less like a problem to be negotiated and more like a person who was very tired. "The man who raised you," she said. "Your father." His expression didn't change, but something in the room did. "What about him?" "Carlo told Agata something this morning. I wasn't trying to listen. The walls here are thin." She paused. "He said something about what your father did, after your sister." The silence that followed was a specific kind. Not hostile, not closed, but the kind that had weight in it, the kind that preceded something being said that hadn't been said in a long time. "Her name was Sophia," Lucien said finally. His voice was very flat. "She was 22. She was killed in a dispute that had nothing to do with her. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong surname." He turned the glass in his hands without drinking from it. "My father declared war on every family in the region that he believed had a hand in it. Spent 4 years burning everything down. Killed 14 people, not all of them guilty. Destroyed 3 decades of arrangements that had kept the body count manageable." He paused. "And at the end of it, Sophia was still dead. And my father was a different man than the one she'd known." Morella was quiet. "I took over the family at 28, he continued, "because my father had made himself into something none of us recognized, and someone had to stop the bleeding." He looked up at her. "That's the version of this story you're in. That's the context." She held his gaze. "How old was she?" "Sophia." "When she died?" 22. He paused. "Your age?" The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the olive trees with a sound like something breathing. "I'm 24, Morella said. "I know." She set her glass down on the counter and pushed off the sink and said, "You should sleep. You're making worse decisions when you're tired. I can tell." He almost smiled. Almost. It was the briefest possible fracture in the surface. You didn't ask Carlo what Luca's sister's name was when you told me that story. You already knew it. You've been thinking about her for hours. That's not strategy. That's guilt. And guilt at 2 in the morning in a room with no sleep is a very specific kind of bad decision-making." He stared at her. "You're very direct." "I'm a waitress. You learn to be direct or you spend your whole shift being invisible." She left him at the kitchen table and went back upstairs. And this time she slept. Not well, not long, but genuinely, dreamlessly, the way a body sleeps when it has finally accepted that the worst has already started and worrying about it won't change the shape of tomorrow. She woke to shouting, not the half-contained argument of yesterday, full volume, close, the kind that arrived in her room like something physical before she was fully conscious. She was on her feet and at the door before she'd decided to move, one hand on the frame, listening. Downstairs. Multiple voices. One of them Lucien's, controlled but with an edge she hadn't heard before. Carlo's, clipped and hard. A third voice she didn't recognize. Higher, faster, the cadence of someone reporting something under pressure. She went to the top of the stairs. Below, in the entrance hall, 3 of Lucien's men were moving with the deliberate urgency of people who had been given a direction and were executing it. Carlo was on the phone. Lucien stood in the center of the hall looking at something on a tablet that one of the men was holding out to him, and his face had the expression she would later think of as the moment the temperature changed. Not anger, not fear, something colder than both, something that came from a place deeper than reaction. He looked up and saw her at the top of the stairs. "Get dressed," he said. "What happened?" "Moretti knows we're here." She gripped the railing. "The coastline. You said it was a wide stretch." He didn't narrow it. Lucien's voice was absolutely level. He was given coordinates. The word landed in the hallway like something dropped from a height. Given. Not discovered. Not deduced. Given. She stared at him from the top of the stairs and felt the floor of the last 18 hours. The library, the kitchen conversations, the careful architecture of "You're safe here. I have men at the perimeter," tilt sharply beneath her feet. Someone inside this house had told Moretti exactly where she was. Lucien held her gaze. In his eyes was something she hadn't seen there before. Not uncertainty, he didn't seem built for uncertainty, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like a man confronting the cost of something he had believed he could control and discovering the limit of that belief. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Carlo." Lucien didn't look away from her. 40 minutes, Carlo said from across the hall. "Maybe less." Morella turned back to the room. She had the canvas bag, the 43 euros, the medical tape on her heel, and the clothes on her back. She had been in this house for less than 24 hours, and already it had been breached. Already the walls had proved thinner than they looked. Already the man who had told her she was safe was standing in the hallway below with the look of someone recalculating everything from the ground up. She grabbed her bag. She was dressed and downstairs in 4 minutes. Lucien was already moving toward the back of the house, Carlo at his shoulder, 2 men ahead of them with weapons drawn. He didn't stop when she fell into step behind him, didn't tell her to stay back, didn't tell her anything, just shot one brief look over his shoulder to confirm she was there and kept moving. They went out through the kitchen, across the grove, toward a second vehicle she hadn't known was parked behind the outbuilding at the property's eastern edge. The night air hit her like cold water, olive branches pulled at her jacket. Somewhere back at the main gate she heard voices. Her side or the other side, she couldn't tell, and didn't stop to determine. At the vehicle, Lucien turned and caught her arm. Not roughly, but with the specific grip of someone making sure a thing doesn't fall, and said very close to her face, "When I put you in the car, you stay down. You don't sit up until I tell you." "Who told him?" she said. "Who in your house told him where we were?" His hand on her arm tightened fractionally. "I'll find out." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." His eyes were completely level on hers. "Get in the car, Morella." She got in the car. The vehicle moved fast through the olive grove and out through a gap in the back fence she hadn't known existed, onto a service road that ran parallel to the coast without touching it, heading south, heading back toward the city and everything in it that wanted them dead. She was pressed low in the back seat with the bag clutched against her chest, and Lucien next to her, one arm across her without touching her, braced against the door, his eyes on the road behind them through the rear window. She could feel the tension in him. Not fear, he genuinely didn't seem to have fear in the ordinary sense, but something else. Something she thought might be the specific fury of a man betrayed by someone close enough to betray him. Someone in the house. Someone who had been inside the perimeter. Someone who had listened to the conversations and known the coordinates and picked up a phone. She thought about Luca, the split lip, the sister in Palermo. She thought about what it cost not to take the money, and then she thought about what it might cost, what it might have already cost, for someone else in that house to make the opposite choice. "Lucien," she said. "Not now." It was Luca. The silence that followed had a texture to it, hard and jagged, like something that had been solid and was no longer. She felt rather than saw him absorb it, the muscles in his arm against the door, the quality of his stillness, the specific way a man goes quiet when something he already half knew becomes something he can no longer. He didn't answer her. That was its own answer. The vehicle moved through the dark at a speed that made the service road feel narrower than it was, the headlights cutting a pale channel through the olive scrub on either side, and Lucien sat with his arm braced against the door and his eyes on the rear window and said absolutely nothing for 45 seconds that felt considerably longer than that. Then he said, to the front, "Carlo." Carlo was in the passenger seat. He turned his head a fraction. "I know. You knew before I did." It wasn't a question. Carlo was quiet for a moment. The quality of quiet that precedes something unwelcome being confirmed rather than denied. "I had a suspicion this morning, after the approach. Something about the timing didn't sit right. The contact knew to approach Luca specifically, not just any available man. That kind of targeting means someone inside fed them the roster. And you didn't tell me. I was running it down. I didn't want to say..." "You didn't want to bring me a suspicion. You wanted to bring me a fact." Lucien's voice was completely without inflection, which Morella was beginning to understand was more dangerous than shouting. "And while you were running it down, Moretti got coordinates." Carlo said nothing. That was the only response available to him. Morella pressed herself against the back of the seat and listened and watched Lucien's profile in the dark and thought about the word given. Not found. Not figured out. Given. She thought about Luca's face in the corridor. That expression she'd finally named as the look of someone who'd done something they couldn't undo. She thought about a sister in Palermo with a known name and a known address and a known schedule, and the very simple, brutal arithmetic of that. "He didn't do it for money," she said. Both men in the front were quiet. Moretti threatened his sister. Luca reported the approach, the conversation, the split lip, all of it, because he thought reporting it was enough, that it would satisfy something. But Moretti's people came back. She could hear the logic of it assembling itself as she spoke, the terrible simplicity of it. They told him reporting it had made things worse for her, that the only way to make it right was to give them what they wanted, and he had to choose between his boss and his sister. The car was quiet. The road bent south, and the lights of the coast appeared briefly to the left before the scrub swallowed them again. "He chose his sister," Lucien said, very quietly. "Yes." Another silence, longer this time. Then, "I would have protected her, if he'd told me." "He didn't know that." "He's worked for me for 8 years. 8 years of working for you," Morella said, "and he still didn't know if you'd protect one girl in Palermo over operational security." She kept her voice neutral, not accusatory. She didn't have the standing for accusatory. She was the girl in the back seat. She was the leverage. She had no ground to lecture from. But neutral. Factual. That's not his failure. She felt rather than saw Lucien absorb that. The way a body absorbs something it can't immediately respond to. A slight internal shift, a recalibration happening below the surface, invisible except to someone watching closely enough. Carlo's phone buzzed. He answered it, listened, said 2 words, ended the call. "They hit the villa," he said. 12 men. Came in from the North Road and the beach simultaneously. "If we'd still been there..." He stopped. If we'd still been there, Morella thought about the kitchen. The cool tile under her feet, the olive grove outside the window, the way Lucien had looked sitting at the table at 2 a.m. with the untouched glass in front of him and the phone face down, the look of a man who couldn't sleep because he was already carrying too much. 12 men. "Where are we going?" she asked. "The city," Lucien said. That's where Moretti's people are concentrated. It's also where mine are. The villa was exposed. Any safe house outside the city is now a liability. If they got the villa coordinates, they may have others." He paused. "In the city I have infrastructure, resources. I can control the environment." "You can control it until someone else inside that infrastructure decides his sister matters more than his loyalty." The words came out harder than she'd intended. She didn't take them back. Lucien turned his head and looked at her directly for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. And she held the look without flinching, and for a moment the air between them had the specific charge of 2 people who have been through enough together in a short time to have earned the right to say difficult things. "Yes," he said. "Until then." He turned back to the window. They drove. The city came back in pieces. First the glow of it against the low clouds, then the outskirts, the industrial edges, the streets that were wide and gray and empty at this hour. Carlo was making calls. Lucienne was receiving them. Morella sat with her bag in her lap and watched Palermo rebuild itself around the car and felt the strange compressed quality of moving back into a danger she'd left rather than away from it. They stopped at a building in a part of the city she didn't recognize. Not the tourist districts, not the residential neighborhoods she knew, but somewhere in between, the kind of block that had warehouses on one end and apartments on the other and kept its business ambiguous by design. The building looked like nothing from the outside. Inside it was 3 floors of operational infrastructure that told her, more clearly than anything Lucian had said directly, exactly what scale of organization she was inside. She was put in a room on the 2nd floor, better than the villa room. A proper bed, a private bathroom, a window that looked onto an interior courtyard rather than the street. Carlo posted a man outside the door, which was the first time since the restaurant that anyone had been explicitly stationed there. She noted the difference. She didn't comment on it. She sat on the bed and listened to the building. It was alive in a way the villa hadn't been. People moving on all 3 floors. Bones. The low sustained hum of people managing a crisis in real time, the specific frequency of organized effort under pressure. Twice she heard Lucien's voice through the floor, not words, just tone. Controlled, directive, the voice that didn't allow for argument. She thought about what he'd said. I would have protected her. She believed him. She wasn't sure why, given every practical reason not to, but she believed him the way you believed certain things about people that you couldn't entirely justify with evidence. Something in the consistency of the behavior, something in what he'd done in the restaurant before he had any reason to do it. That didn't make her safe. Believing in someone's intentions and being safe in their hands were 2 separate things, and she'd been conflating them for the past 24 hours in ways she could no longer afford. At 6 in the morning, Agatha appeared with coffee. Morella hadn't known Agatha had come with them from the villa. She took the coffee and said, "Did you sleep?" "A little," Agatha said, which probably meant no. "How long have you been with the family?" Agatha looked at her with that brief, full inventory look. "Since before Lucienne was born." "Then you knew Sophia." Something in Agatha's face moved. It was small and it was fast and it was real. The involuntary response that names of the dead produce in people who loved them. "Yes," she said. "What was she like?" Agatha was quiet for a moment. She straightened the already straight towel on the bathroom rail. "She laughed the same way you do," she said, and left. Morella sat with the coffee and that sentence and didn't move for a long time. Lucien came at 8. He looked like he hadn't slept at all, which she was fairly certain he hadn't, but he had the focused clarity of someone running on something more concentrated than rest. He sat across from her on the room's single chair and put his hands on his knees and said, "I found Luca." She waited. "He's at his sister's apartment. He hasn't run. He was—" A pause, brief and particular. "He was sitting outside her door, in the corridor, just sitting there." She could picture it with a completeness that hurt. Young man, split lip, sitting in a hallway outside his sister's door because he'd burned every other shelter he had, and that was the last one, and he knew it wouldn't hold. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I've already done it." He looked at her steadily. "I had his sister move to a location Moretti can't reach. 2 of my people with her, full protection, indefinitely. And then I had a conversation with Luca." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I told him what I just told you, that I would have protected her if he'd come to me." His jaw was tight. "And that what he did put you in more danger than you were already in, and that I needed to know everything Moretti's people told him and everything he gave them." "Did he tell you?" "Yes." "Everything?" Lucian's eyes on hers were very direct. "I believe so." She absorbed this. "What did he give them besides the coordinates?" "The number of men at the villa, the vehicle descriptions, the general timeline of movement." He paused. "And one other thing. The way he said it, the specific weight he put on it, the fractional hesitation before it, made the back of her neck tighten." "What other thing?" Lucienne looked at her for a moment in a way she hadn't seen from him before. It was almost careful. Lucien de Luca was not a careful man in the emotional sense. He was precise, he was controlled, but carefulness implied a concern for how information would land, and she hadn't seen that from him yet. Moretti asked for information about you specifically, he said. Your background, your family, your mother. The coffee cup in her hand was very still. Luca told him what he knew, which wasn't much. Your name, that you were a waitress, that your mother lived on the coast east of the city. He paused. But Moretti's people were already running a separate line of inquiry. They'd identified you by the time Luca spoke to them. They knew more than Luca did. She set the cup down because her hand had stopped being reliable. What did they know? Lucien's expression didn't change. Your father, he said. The room got very quiet. My father left when I was 9, she said. Her voice came out flat. I haven't spoken to him in 15 years. I don't know where he is. You do now, Lucien said. Or rather, you know where he was. A pause that had something inside it she couldn't fully read yet. His name isn't Vale. Vale was your mother's name. His name is Renato Cava. She knew that name. Everyone in Palermo knew that name. The knowledge arrived not as a revelation, but as a collapse. The specific sensation of a floor you'd been standing on for years suddenly revealing that it was never solid, that what you'd taken for ground was something thinner and more temporary. Renato Cava. The name her mother had never spoken with anything but flat-voiced avoidance, the name that appeared in certain conversations between certain people and caused other people to go quiet. The name attached to a history she had never connected to herself, because why would she? Why would anyone? She was a girl from Cefalù, whose father had left when she was small, and that was the entirety of what she'd known. Renato Cava had been one of the original architects of the structure that eventually became the Moretti operation. Not Matteo Moretti, his predecessor, his foundation, the man whose connections and networks Moretti had absorbed when he'd consolidated his position 18 months ago. Cava had died 4 years prior. She would learn later that it was not natural causes, and the absorption of his network into Moretti's had been the cornerstone of Moretti's rise, which meant that Morella Vale, waitress, 24, bad left shoe, was the biological daughter of the man whose infrastructure Matteo Moretti had built his empire on, which meant she wasn't leverage in the ordinary sense. She was inheritance. He thinks... Her voice stopped. She started again. Moretti thinks I know something about Cava's operation, about assets or networks or... There was a financial structure, Lucien said. He was watching her with the careful expression still in place. Accounts, properties, interests embedded in legitimate businesses. Cava's version of a legacy. Moretti absorbed the operational side when he took over, but the financial architecture was never fully located. Cava's lawyers stonewalled for 2 years before the last of them stopped cooperating. He paused. Moretti believes Cava left documentation, instructions, a map, essentially, to what wasn't transferred. And he thinks Cava gave it to me. He thinks Cava may have attempted to. In the last year before his death, Moretti's intelligence suggests Cava made inquiries about your location. Whether he found you, whether any contact was made. No contact was made, she said, hard and flat. No one contacted me. I didn't know the man's real name. I didn't know anything. I believe you. It doesn't matter whether you believe me. She stood up. She couldn't sit anymore. The compression of the chair, the compression of the room, the compression of everything she thought she'd known about herself rewriting itself in real time. She moved to the window and looked at the interior courtyard below. Empty. Pale stone. A potted plant that needed water. It matters what Moretti believes. Yes. He's not going to stop. She turned from the window. This isn't about you anymore. Or not only about you. He was going to come for me regardless of what happened at the restaurant. You were incidental. I was already on his list. Something moved in Lucien's face. You were on a list. Not at the top. I'm at the top now. She heard the steadiness in her own voice and recognized it as the same thing she used when the tourist tables were being difficult. The professional surface held over whatever was happening underneath. The skill that had kept her functional through 100 bad shifts and was apparently going to have to keep her functional through this too. He needs to know if I have what he's looking for. Once he determines I don't, I won't let that happen. You didn't know who I was 20 minutes ago. She looked at him directly. How does that change anything you're able to promise? He stood. He was across the room in a few steps, not rushed, but with the directional certainty of someone who had decided something and was acting on it. He stopped close enough that she could see the exhaustion he was carrying beneath the surface, the specific hollowness around the eyes of someone who had been running on controlled fury for 36 hours. It changes the scope, he said. It doesn't change what I said. Which was? That I won't give you to him. She held his gaze. Her chest felt like something was pressing on it from the inside. That's going to cost you more than you thought. Probably. You should think about whether I'm worth that. I've thought about very little else since last night. He said it simply, without drama, with the particular weight of a man stating something factual rather than performing something emotional. And that simplicity was somehow the thing that finally cracked the professional surface she'd been maintaining, just fractionally, just enough that she had to look away from him at the water-needing potted plant in the courtyard below and breathe carefully for a moment. Then Carlo was in the doorway, and the moment, whatever it had been, was over. We have a problem, Carlo said. Lucien didn't turn. Define problem. Moretti's moved up the timeline. He's not waiting until Friday. Carlo's voice was careful in the way it got when the information was bad enough to require some management in the delivery. He made a public move this morning, took out 2 of our distribution points in the Port District, broad daylight, didn't try to conceal it. He's declaring. Lucien turned then. Casualties? 3 of ours injured, nobody dead. A pause. This time. He wants me to respond. He wants you to come out. He knows you're contained right now. Every move you make risks exposing her location. Carlo glanced at Morella, brief and professional. He's using that. He knows you won't move aggressively while she's unresolved. She understood the geometry of it immediately. Moretti had turned her into an anchor. Every action Lucien took to protect her was an action he couldn't take against Moretti, and every day she remained in play was a day the pressure on Lucien's organization compounded. The port strikes were a demonstration, not an attempt to do lasting damage, but a message delivered in the language of force. I can hit you where it hurts, and you can't hit back because you're busy being compromised by a girl you met 3 days ago. She heard her own voice say, "Let me help." Both men looked at her. I heard you last night, she said, talking about using me as bait, drawing Moretti into a controlled confrontation. She looked at Lucien. You said accelerating the timeline was an option. It was a theoretical option. It's a real one now. He's already accelerating your shit. You're just not doing it on your terms. She moved away from the window, stood in the center of the room. I'm not going to spend the next week in a box while Moretti hits your operation piece by piece and you try to manage both things at once. That's not survivable for either of us. You don't have experience with... I have experience with being underestimated. The words came out sharp and she didn't soften them. I have experience with being the problem in the room that everyone is managing around instead of with. And I have 24 years of being Renato Cava's daughter without knowing it, which means I have something Moretti wants badly enough to burn your villa and strike your ports in broad daylight. She paused. Use that. The room was very quiet. Carlo looked at Lucien with an expression that was professionally unreadable but contained, Morella thought, the smallest possible amount of reassessment. Lucien looked at her for a long time. You understand what you're proposing. I'm proposing that we stop being reactive. You'd be exposed. I'm already exposed. She held his gaze. The only question is whether my exposure serves a purpose or just runs down the clock. Another silence. Longer. The kind that preceded a decision that couldn't be undone. Then Lucien said to Carlo, "Get Ferrara on the phone." Carlo left. Lucien looked at her. "There are things I need to tell you," he said, "about how this would work, about the risks, and about your father. There's more. Things I held back because I wasn't sure how much." His phone rang. He looked at the screen and his expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the way that specific numbers cause specific reactions in people who lived inside the architecture of threat. He answered it. She watched his face as he listened. She watched something happen to it that she hadn't seen happen before. Not the controlled hardness, Not the exhaustion, but something underneath both of those. Something that reached further back, something older. He said 2 words into the phone. "How long?" Then he lowered it. He looked at her, and in his face was the specific expression of someone who has just received information that changes the shape of everything they thought they were navigating. And Morella felt the room tilt the same way it had tilted when she'd heard the name Renato Cava, the same structural lurch of ground that was never as solid as it seemed. "What?" she said. "Moretti doesn't just have a position on where you are," Lucian said. His voice was absolutely controlled, which was the most alarming thing about it. "He has your mother." The word arrived in her chest like something blunt. "His people were in Cefalù before dawn," Lucian continued. "They took her from the bakery on her way into the early shift. She's been in Moretti's hands for approximately 4 hours. Morella's mouth opened. No sound came out. "He's made contact through an intermediary. His terms are simple." Lucien's eyes were steady on her, and in them was something that looked like what it cost a man to deliver a sentence like this to a person he had decided to protect. "He wants you, in person, alone, at a location of his choosing, by tonight." A pause. "Or your mother doesn't come home." The walls of the room were very still. The city outside was continuing its morning with complete indifference. Somewhere below, Carlo was on the phone with someone named Ferrara, setting in motion plans that had just become irrelevant. Morella stood in the center of the room and felt herself arrive at the precise edge of something. The place past which everything that had gotten her here, the endurance, the professional calm, the careful maintenance of the surface, none of it applied anymore. Past this edge, there was only the choice, and the choice was already made. Had been made the moment Lucian said the word mother, had been made long before she had any say in it. She looked at Lucien. "Tell me the location," she said. "Mirella, tell me the location." Her voice was very quiet and very final. "And then tell me the rest of what you know about my father. All of it. Because if I'm walking into Moretti's hands tonight, I need to know exactly what he thinks I'm carrying. And I need you to help me make him believe." He told her everything. Not in the way of a man unburdening himself, said. Lucien de Luca did not unburden, did not confess, did not offer information as a form of emotional relief. He told her the way an architect explains a building that is currently on fire, systematically, precisely, with the specific urgency of someone who understands that the structure of what she knew had to be rebuilt from the foundation up before she walked into anything. Renato Cava had been meticulous. That was the word Lucian used. Meticulous in the way that men who anticipated their own deaths tended to be. Not paranoid, not sentimental, but organized with the cold clarity of someone managing their own legacy like an asset portfolio. In the 18 months before he died, Cava had begun the process of externalizing. Moving resources out of the operational network and into structures that existed at an oblique angle to it. Real estate instruments, shell interests in legitimate companies, a financial architecture that was technically traceable but practically opaque unless you had the specific thread to pull. Moretti had pulled every thread he could find. He'd gotten most of it. Not all. The piece he hadn't gotten was documented. Somewhere, Cava's remaining lawyers had confirmed its existence under enough pressure to make the confirmation reliable before they'd stop talking. A record, physical, not digital, because Cava had been old school about the things that mattered, that mapped the untransferred assets. Accounts, properties, names of people who held things in trust. The total value, by Moretti's estimation, was somewhere between 60 and 90 million euros. Cava had made inquiries about Morella in the last year of his life. Whether he'd found her, whether he'd reached her, whether he'd entrusted her with anything, documentation, a location, a name, a key to a box somewhere, Moretti didn't know. That uncertainty was the engine of everything. Moretti didn't need her to actually have it. He needed to determine with certainty that she didn't. The methods he'd used to determine that were not the methods of a man who accepted no for an answer. "You think the documentation exists," Morella said. "I think Cava was thorough enough that it does, yes." "Do you want it?" Lucien looked at her steadily. "I want Moretti neutralized. If that documentation is part of the mechanism, then yes." "That's a careful answer." It's an honest one. She stood with this for a moment. The room around them was very still, the city outside continuing its indifferent mourning, and somewhere in Cefalù, or wherever Moretti's people had taken her, her mother was sitting in a room that was nothing like this one, waiting in the specific terror of someone who had spent 58 years expecting the world to deliver something terrible and had finally been proven right. "I don't have it," Mirella said. "Whatever your father, whatever Cava was trying to leave me, it never arrived. I received nothing, no letters, no packages, no contact of any kind." "I know. Moretti doesn't." "No." She looked at him. "So I walk in there and I don't have what he wants, and he—" She stopped. She made herself finish it. "He decides I've been holding out on him, or he decides he needs to be sure. And either way, you don't walk in there alone," Lucian said. His terms are designed to isolate you. We don't accept his terms. We accept his location and his timeline, and we build around it." He moved to the table where Carlo had left a city map, spread it flat. "This is what I've been doing since 4 this morning." She came to the table. He walked her through it, not in the way of a man explaining to someone who wouldn't understand, but in the way of someone briefing a collaborator, laying out the geography and the personnel and the decision points with the same precision he'd used for everything else. She listened. She asked questions. He answered them. Carlo came back in, and the three of them stood around that map and built a thing out of necessity and available resources and the specific pressure of a deadline that was now measured in hours. The location Moretti had specified was an abandoned winery 12 kilometers outside the city. Lucien knew it. It was the kind of location chosen by people who wanted controlled isolation. The surrounding land was flat enough for vehicle surveillance from a distance. But the winery complex itself was a maze of connected stone buildings and internal courtyards that made close-range movement unpredictable. Moretti would have men inside and outside. He would keep Morella's mother contained separately. Insurance, the standard geometry of hostage leverage. Until he had what he wanted or had determined that he wasn't going to get it. The window was 6 hours. After 6 hours, regardless of outcome, Moretti's operational exposure became untenable, and his decisions would simplify in the direction that simplified decisions always went. "Your job," Lucian said, "is to keep him talking." She looked up from the map. "About what?" "About the documentation, about Cava, about whatever he thinks you know." He held her gaze. "You don't know where it is, but you cannot know in ways that take time. You can suggest, you can imply. You can be the kind of person who is almost about to give something up and then isn't. Every minute you keep him engaged and uncertain is a minute my people have. And when he stops being patient, he won't get the chance." She looked at him for a moment. "You believe that?" "I have to." It was the first time he'd said something like that to her. Not, "I will handle it," not "trust me," but "I have to," which acknowledged the possibility of failure while asserting the necessity of moving forward anyway. It was, she thought, the most honest thing he'd said to her yet, and it settled in her chest in a way that the confident statements hadn't. "Okay," she said. The next 4 hours were the strangest of her life. Carlo's people fitted her with a transmitter, small, almost invisible, tucked into the inner seam of her jacket. A man she hadn't met before, quiet and technical, explained in precise terms what it would and wouldn't do. It would transmit audio. It would transmit location. It would not protect her from anything physical. He said this last part with the specific neutrality of someone whose job required him to be accurate, regardless of whether accuracy was comforting. She ate. Agatha brought food she didn't taste, and she ate it methodically because Lucien told her to, because he said her hands needed to be steady and low blood sugar was a liability, because the only practical thing available to her at this point was to take care of the instrument of her own survival with the same focus she'd have given a difficult Saturday shift. She called Carlo and asked for information about her mother. He gave her what he had. Taken outside the bakery on her morning walk-in, a white vehicle, no visible injury at the time of acquisition. The phrase acquisition sat in Morella's stomach like a stone. At noon, Lucian found her in the corridor outside her room. She was standing at the window at the end of the hall looking at the street below. Ordinary street, ordinary afternoon. People moving through their ordinary lives with the complete obliviousness of people who had not been informed that anything unusual was happening today. He stopped beside her. They stood in silence for a moment. "Tell me something that's not about this," she said. He was quiet for a beat. Then, "Sophia used to dance in the kitchen when she thought nobody could see her." Mirella looked at him. Not professionally. She wasn't trained. She just moved when music was on. She thought it embarrassed the family. She'd stop the moment anyone walked in. He paused. "I used to stand in the corridor and not walk in, so she'd keep going." She held that image, an older brother standing in a hallway so his sister could keep dancing. "How long ago?" 12 years. She looked back at the street. She would have liked the restaurant, she said. "The terrace, Salvatore playing." "Yes." A pause. "She would have liked you." She didn't answer that. She couldn't, quite. At 2 in the afternoon, they left for the winery. Mirella rode in a separate vehicle. Her own visible arrival was part of the design. A single car, no obvious escort, the performance of compliance. The transmitter was active. Her hands were in her lap and they were steady, which she credited to the bread and oil and the sheer exhausted flatness that had replaced the shaking sometime that morning. She watched the city give way to the road give way to flat agricultural land, the sky above it large and pale and indifferent. The winery appeared at the end of a long stone drive. It was everything Lucian's description had prepared her for, and nothing she'd actually been able to imagine until she saw it. The collapsed grandeur of it, the stone buildings with their blown-out windows and rust-stained walls, the dead machinery standing in the open yard like monuments to something that had stopped working a long time ago. The smell of it reached her through the car window. Old wood, dust, the ghost of fermentation from decades past. And underneath it all, the smell of standing water and something chemical she couldn't identify. There were vehicles already there, 5 that she could count. The driver stopped at the edge of the courtyard. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. He didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. She got out. The courtyard was large and open, bordered on 3 sides by the stone buildings and on the 4th by the collapsed roof of what had been the main fermentation hall. The moon was still visible above the eastern edge of the buildings. It was only mid-afternoon, but the sky had gone gray, the flat gray of a Sicilian afternoon threatening rain that might not come. Moretti's men materialized from the building entrances around the courtyard as she walked in, 6 of them visible. More behind the geometry of the walls, certainly. They watched her move through the yard with the professional attentiveness of people told to expect a threat and confronted with a girl in a jacket and canvas bag instead. Matteo Moretti came out of the main building. She'd built him in her imagination from what she knew. The name, the reputation, the things Lucien had said and not said. The reality of him was smaller than the imagination, which she supposed was true of most powerful men. He was 60, compact, with the careful grooming of someone who understood presentation as a form of argument. He had a stillness about him that she recognized as a kind of violence held in reserve, the stillness of a man who had long since stopped needing to demonstrate anything to anyone. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, like an acquisition waiting to be completed. "Mirella Vale," he said. His voice was pleasant. That was the worst thing about it. "Where's my mother?" she said. "Safe." He gestured toward the main building. "Come inside." "Where's my mother?" He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not irritation exactly, more like the mild recalibration of a man who had expected a different opening. "She's inside," he said. "Comfortable. Unharmed. She'll stay that way contingent on how this conversation goes." He paused. "Come inside, Mirella. You've come this far." She went inside. The main building was a long stone hall with a barrel-vaulted ceiling that had partially collapsed at the far end, exposing a ragged hole of gray sky. The floor was debris, broken barrel staves, shattered glass, accumulated years of disuse compressed into a layer of grit that crunched under her feet. The light came from battery-powered work lamps set up at intervals, harsh and white, casting hard shadows from the wreckage. Her mother was at the far end of the hall, seated on a wooden chair with her wrists bound in front of her, and 2 men standing either side of her. She was wearing her bakery uniform, the blue apron she'd had for years, the one with the small tear at the pocket that she'd been meaning to repair for as long as Morella could remember. She was pale. Her jaw was set in the specific way Morella had seen it set at every difficult moment of her childhood. Hard and contained, the woman who had raised her alone refusing, on principle, to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. Their eyes met across the length of the hall. Morella's mother said nothing. Her jaw tightened fractionally. She gave a single small nod that contained about 40 different things, chief among them, "I'm all right, and don't you dare make a decision based on me." Morella looked away before she could let that get into her chest, where it would make her stupid. Moretti sat down in a chair that had been placed in the center of the hall with the deliberate staging of someone who understood the theater of authority. He crossed one leg over the other and looked at Morella standing in the debris with the work lamps throwing her shadow long across the floor. "Your father," he said, "was a brilliant man. Infuriating, but brilliant." He said it with the particular tone of a man who has absorbed someone else's empire and chosen to speak well of the man who built it. He prepared for everything, except dying, of course. None of us fully prepare for that. A slight smile that didn't reach anything above his mouth. He made arrangements. I've recovered most of them. One piece remains outstanding. He looked at her directly. I believe he made contact with you before the end. He didn't. I believe he sent you documentation, a record of assets my people haven't been able to locate. He didn't contact me. Her voice was level. She was thinking about what Lucian had said, not know in ways that take time. I didn't know who he was until this morning. And yet here you are. He spread his hands slightly. His daughter. His only child, as far as we've been able to determine. If Kava wanted to leave something outside the operational network, outside the reach of anyone who might contest it, who better than a child who didn't know she was his child, who couldn't be pressured in advance because she didn't know to be pressured? She made herself breathe, made herself think. The logic was sound. She could see it, could see how it would look from the outside, could see why a man like Moretti would find it compelling even without evidence. An innocent carrier, someone who received something without knowing what it was. If he sent me something, she said slowly, I didn't recognize it for what it was. I didn't know his name. Anything he sent would have looked like... She paused, let herself seem to be working through it, which she was, but not in the direction Moretti thought. It could have looked like anything. Moretti leaned forward fractionally. A tell. The first one she'd spotted. He wanted this. He wanted the possibility alive more than he wanted to be right about her knowing. Think about the past year, he said. Letters, packages, anything unexpected from an unknown sender. She let her face do something, not a full revelation, just a fracture. A slight parting of the professional surface, as if something had just surfaced from a depth. She watched his eyes move to it. There was a letter, she said. The hall was very quiet. 6 months ago. I didn't know who it was from. No return address. I thought it might have been from him, my father, the man I knew as my father who left. I didn't open it for weeks. She paused. When I opened it, I didn't understand most of it. Numbers, a name I didn't recognize. I threw most of it away. Most of it, Moretti said. She let the pause extend just long enough. I kept one page. I don't know why. It seemed, I don't know. I kept it. Where is it? I don't have it with me. Where is it? At my apartment in Palermo. She held his gaze. I can take you there. He looked at her for a long moment. She could feel the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of plausibility against risk, the assessment of whether this was truth or performance, the fundamental problem of a man who needed information he could only get from a source he couldn't fully trust. Or, he said, you tell me exactly where in your apartment. I need to be there. I need to show you. She let something into her voice. Not begging, not desperation. Something more specific. The tone of a person offering the one thing that keeps them alive. That's the only way this works. I go with you, I show you, and then you let us go. Moretti stood. He moved toward her, and she held her ground while everything in her wanted to step back, while every instinct she had was reporting the specific information that this man was dangerous in a way that the guns around the room were not, because the guns were tools held by hired hands, and this man was the decision itself. He stopped close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and cold. "If you're wasting my time, he said quietly, "your mother's situation changes. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes. If there's no letter, there's a letter." She held his gaze without blinking. "I know what happens if I'm lying to you. I'm not lying." He studied her face for a long moment with the specific attention of a man who had spent decades reading people for profit. Then he stepped back. "Get the vehicles ready," he said to the room. He looked at Mirella. "You ride with me." She turned toward her mother. "I need to know She comes. She rides separately. She remains unharmed as long as you cooperate." He tilted his head slightly. "You have my word, for what it's worth to you." She looked at her mother again. Her mother's jaw was still set. Her eyes were steady on Mirella's. They held each other's gaze for just a second, and in that second passed the compressed language of 24 years. Every difficult morning, every double shift, every conversation had across small kitchen tables with not enough money and too much love. And Mirella nodded once, small and precise, and turned away. Outside, the vehicles were moving. Moretti's men organizing themselves with the efficiency of people following a rehearsed protocol. 6 vehicles total, she counted, plus the ones she hadn't been able to see from the courtyard. She was guided to Moretti's car, the second in the convoy, black, armored in a way that she could feel in the weight of the door as it closed. Moretti sat across from her. 2 men in the front, one beside her in the back, between her and the door. The convoy moved out of the winery, down the stone drive, back onto the flat road toward the city. She pressed her left arm against her ribs where the transmitter was. Active. Lucien's people would have the audio, the location, the movement. The plan, such as it was, built in 4 hours from necessity and available parts, was running. She was doing her part of it. She was also, she understood very clearly, in a moving armored vehicle surrounded by 6 of Moretti's men with no exit and no guarantee that the thing she'd set in motion was going to arrive in time. Her hands were in her lap. Still. She was proud of them for that. Moretti was on his phone. Low voice, Italian too fast and Sicilian accented for her to catch more than fragments. She caught the word via and the word tonight and the word done, and the geometry of those 3 words in that order told her something that tightened her chest in a new and specific way. He wasn't planning to let any of them go. The letter was a reason to move her to a known location. The apartment in Palermo was a place where whatever happened next could happen without the logistical complications of the winery's exposure. Once he had her there, once he determined in whatever way he was going to determine it that the letter existed or didn't, the operational calculation simplified. She became a variable that had been resolved. Her mother became the same. She looked at the city coming back into view through the tinted glass. The familiar streets, the buildings she'd moved through for 2 years on her way between work and the small apartment that she'd made as close to home as 43 euros at a time allowed. The streets looked the same. Everything looked the same. The convoy slowed at a junction. The traffic light above the intersection turned red, and the lead vehicle stopped, and the convoy compressed behind it. Moretti's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Something in his posture changed. A slight tightening, the body responding to information before the mind had fully processed it. Then every window in the car went white. Not an explosion. She thought explosion first, the way you did. The way the body cataloged the loudest, most sudden thing as the most dangerous thing. But flash grenades, 3 of them, detonating simultaneously outside the convoy's flanks, turning the tinted windows into walls of light and flooding the interior with a disorientation that hit her like a physical blow despite knowing, somewhere in the back of her mind, that it was coming. Moretti's man beside her grabbed her arm. She drove her elbow into his face with everything she had. Not skillfully, not with any training, just with the absolute committed force of a person who understood that this was the moment and half measures were the same as nothing. His grip loosened. She was already moving toward the door when the door opened from the outside, and a hand she recognized reached in and she took it. And she was out of the car and into the street and into noise that was enormous and everywhere. Shouts, the screech of the lead vehicle trying to accelerate, the flat, hard crack of controlled gunfire from positions she couldn't locate and didn't need to. Lucien pulled her hard against the side of the building closest to the junction, his body between her and the street, his hand at the back of her head pressing her face into his shoulder. She could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, fast, hard, the body running on adrenaline and will, and she grabbed the front of his jacket with both hands and held on while the street around them went through the specific compressed violence of trained people with clear objectives working fast. It was over in under 2 minutes. When it was over, she lifted her head. The convoy was stopped. 3 vehicles. Moretti's men were on the ground. Not all of them. She saw 2 being handled with zip ties by men she recognized from the building on the 2nd floor. The 3rd vehicle, the one behind Moretti's, the one she hadn't been able to see from inside the armored car. Its rear door was open and Carlo was standing beside it, and her mother was standing beside Carlo, wrists free, still in her bakery apron, the small tear at the pocket catching the gray afternoon light. Her mother looked across the street at her. Mirella let go of Lucien's jacket and crossed the street at something between a walk and a run, and her mother's arms came up, and that was where she went. Into the blue apron, into the smell of flour and wood smoke that she would never in her life be able to separate from the concept of safety. And she put her face into her mother's shoulder and didn't make a sound, just held on, just breathed, while her mother's hand pressed hard against the back of her head, the same way it had pressed when she was 9 years old, and her father had left and the world had changed shape overnight. Then Carlo's voice. "We need to move. Now. He's not in the vehicles." She lifted her head. Lucien was already turning. His face had changed, the relief of a successful operation overwritten in real time by the specific hardness of unfinished business. "Moretti," she said. "He was out before the grenades hit. Someone warned him." Lucien's jaw was tight. "He's in the city, on foot or in a vehicle we haven't identified." He looked at her, and in his eyes was the acknowledgement of something unresolved, something that had escaped the net. The one thread left loose in a thing that needed to be finished. "We need to—" The shot came from the upper floor of the building behind him. She saw it before she heard it, saw him stagger forward, saw the dark bloom at his left shoulder, saw his hand go to it with the specific reflexive gesture of a body registering damage. He didn't go down. He turned toward the source with a fury that was almost past expression, already moving, already directional. And Carlo was pulling Mirella and her mother toward the nearest vehicle, and Lucien's men were moving on the building, and the city was going loud again around them, the gray afternoon sky above Palermo holding everything in its enormous indifference, while in a street below, the last piece of something that had started 3 days ago in a restaurant with a spinning girl and a man watching from a dark corner booth moved toward. The bullet had gone through the meat of his left shoulder above the bone, clean enough that it wasn't immediately disabling, but bad enough that the blood came fast and dark through his fingers when he pressed his hand against it. He didn't stop moving. The building was a 4-story residential block, the kind that had been divided and subdivided over decades until its original architecture was barely legible beneath the accumulated modifications. The shot had come from the 3rd floor, east-facing window, the angle consistent with someone who had positioned themselves before the convoy reached the junction, which meant the warning to Moretti had come early enough for placement, which meant the leak was not over, which meant there was a second person inside his organization who had been working against him and had been doing it long enough to have anticipated this specific operation. He went in through the street-level door with 2 of his men behind him and the shoulder screaming with every impact of foot on stone stair, and he paid the pain the minimum attention it required to prevent it from becoming a liability and gave the rest of his attention to what was above him. 3rd floor, east side. The door was open when they reached it. Not fled through, open, which was a choice, which was a statement, which told him something about the person on the other side of it before he entered. He went in low and fast. The room was a gutted apartment, the furniture stripped to a single chair and a folding table. The window still open to the gray afternoon where the rifle rested against the sill like something set down rather than abandoned. The man in the chair had his hands visible on his thighs, and he was looking at the door with the specific expression of someone who had made a decision and was sitting inside it. Lucien knew his face. He was 41, former military, had been with the DeLuca organization for 11 years. His name was Sergio. He had a daughter in Palermo, 12 years old, whom he raised alone. He had been at Lucien's right hand for a decade and had been, in every observable way, exactly what he appeared to be: loyal, competent, contained. "Sergio," Lucien said. "I missed on purpose," Sergio said. His voice was even, the voice of a man who had already finished the internal argument and arrived somewhere past it. "I needed it to look like an attempt." Lucien's men had their weapons on him. Sergio didn't look at them. He looked at Lucien. "Moretti had my daughter," Sergio said. "Not threatened. Had. She's been in a location I didn't know for 3 weeks. I've been compliant for 3 weeks." He paused. "When your operation today started moving, his people contacted me. Told me to fire. Told me if I didn't..." He stopped. He looked down at his hands on his thighs. "I missed. I called in the window position to Carlo's secondary line the moment the shot was fired." The shoulder was bleeding steadily. Lucien could feel the warmth of it moving down his arm inside his sleeve. He looked at Sergio in the chair with his hands visible and his face carrying everything he'd been carrying for 3 weeks and said, "Where is she?" Something broke open in Sergio's expression, just briefly. The cracking of a surface held under enormous pressure for a very long time. "I don't know. They never told me We'll find her." Lucien kept his voice flat. Not cold, flat. The difference mattered. "Carlo." He didn't look away from Sergio. "Get Ferrara on the secondary location search. Everything we pulled from Moretti's men at the junction, phones, contacts, any property registry connected to the shell names." He paused. "She's 12. Her name is Giada. That's the priority." Carlo, at his shoulder, was already on the phone. Sergio looked at Lucien and didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough in the specific way of someone who has been holding something back so long that releasing it changes the quality of the voice itself. "I'm sorry," he said. I know it doesn't. I know why you did it," Lucien said. "That doesn't make it clean. We'll talk about what comes next after she's safe." He turned toward the door. The shoulder was demanding more of his attention now, the body insisting with increasing urgency on being heard. "Get him out of here." Downstairs in the street, the aftermath was being managed. His people worked fast and without noise, the compressed, efficient movement of a well-trained organization doing what it did when it had to. The civilians who had scattered at the flash grenades were still scattered, which was fine, which bought time. The city had heard what it had heard and seen what it had seen, and was in the process of deciding how much of it was real. Moretti was somewhere in it. Carlo met him at the car. One look at the shoulder and Carlo said nothing, just opened the rear door and said to the driver, "Bianchi's place, fast." Morella was in the car. She'd been put there when the second shot was fired, she and her mother both. And she looked at him getting in with the blood soaking through his jacket sleeve, and her face did something that she controlled very quickly, but not quickly enough for him to miss. "It's not the bone," he said, getting in. "You don't know that." "I know what bone feels like." He pulled the door shut. "I've been shot before." That's not reassuring." Her mother, sitting across from them, looked at Lucien with the specific expression of a woman who had been abducted from her bakery that morning, zip-tied in a winery, and was now sitting in an armored car watching a man she'd never met before bleed through his jacket while her daughter argued with him about the nature of the injury. Her expression was the expression of someone revising, rapidly, her entire model of how the world was organized. "Amara," she said. Morella's name in her mother's mouth, the shortened form she only used in serious moments. "Who is this man?" The car moved. The city went past the windows. Morella looked at her mother, then at Lucien, then back at her mother. "It's complicated," she said. Her mother looked at the blood. "I can see that." Bianchi turned out to be a doctor, or had been, once, before something in his history had made conventional practice impractical. He worked out of the back rooms of a pharmacy in a part of the city that minded its own business by long-standing collective agreement. He was 60-something and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had treated this category of injury many times before and had stopped being surprised by the circumstances that produced it. He worked on Lucian's shoulder at a steel table in a back room that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. Morella's mother sat in the anteroom with Agatha, who had materialized from somewhere in the organizational machinery with tea that nobody had asked for and that everyone drank anyway. Carlo stood in the corridor with his phone. The building was quiet in the specific way of a place that had been made quiet deliberately. Morella stayed in the room while Bianchi worked. She stayed because nobody told her not to, and because the part of her that had been managing surfaces and enduring things and holding the professional calm in place through 4 days of consecutive disasters needed, now that the worst of it was over or approaching over, to be somewhere rather than in the anteroom pretending to drink tea. Lucien sat shirtless on the steel table and looked at the wall while Bianchi cleaned and closed the wound with the matter-of-fact attention of a man solving a mechanical problem. And Morella stood to one side and watched and said nothing. The wound was deep, but Lucien had been right about the bone. Bianchi confirmed it with a brevity that suggested he'd expected worse. The blood loss was significant, but not critical. 2 weeks of limited use, antibiotics, no sudden movements. No sudden movements, Morella said, when Bianchi had stepped out. I heard. I'm just repeating it. I understood it the first time. She looked at him on the table, the lines of him, the damage that was new and the damage that was older, the scars that mapped a decade of choices made in this specific register of risk. He was looking at the wall still, the focused inward look of someone managing pain, with the technique of someone who had been managing it for a long time. Sergio, she said. Yes. Another Luca. He was quiet for a moment. Different circumstances, same geometry. He turned his head and looked at her. I should have built something where they didn't have to choose. She held his gaze. Can you build that? I don't know. He said it without deflection. I've been trying to determine whether the organization I inherited is capable of being something different, whether it's possible to shift the weight of it in a direction that doesn't keep producing this. He paused. Today I'm less certain than I was yesterday. You found the girl, she said. Ferrara's team had called 20 minutes before they'd reached Bianchi. Giada, 12 years old, held in a property outside the city in a way that, according to the report Carlo had relayed with professional neutrality, had been frightening but not harmful. She was on her way back to Palermo. She was safe. You found her before you did anything else. That was the minimum. It wasn't the minimum. The minimum was finishing Moretti. You made her the priority. She let that sit between them for a moment. That's not nothing, Lucien. He looked at her with an expression she'd been learning over the past 4 days. The one that wasn't quite closed and wasn't quite open. The one that existed in the space between who he'd built himself to be and whoever was underneath that construction, visible now in the specific vulnerability of sitting shirtless on a steel table in a pharmacy back room with a freshly closed bullet wound and nothing left to manage. Moretti is still out there, he said. I know. This isn't finished. I know that too. He held her gaze. You should take your mother and go somewhere. Somewhere outside Sicily, at least until this is resolved. I can arrange... Stop, she said. He stopped. Don't arrange something for me to disappear into while you finish this alone. She kept her voice level. I'm the reason your shoulder looks like that. I'm the reason any of this week happened. And I'm Renato Cava's daughter, which means I have something to do with how this ends, whether I'm in the room or not. She paused. So tell me what you need. He looked at her for a long time. Bianchi's antiseptic smell was everywhere, and the city outside was doing whatever the city did in the aftermath of things that happened in its streets and forgot themselves in its traffic. And Morella stood in the back room of a pharmacy with her canvas bag still over her shoulder and her jacket with the transmitter still in the seam, and held Lucien De Luca's gaze until he exhaled, just once, carefully, like a man releasing something he'd been holding at significant cost, and said, The documentation. Yes. If it exists, if Cava actually created it and actually tried to reach you, There may be a way to locate it that doesn't require you to have received it. His lawyers, the ones who stonewalled Moretti's people, they stonewalled Moretti. They didn't necessarily have instructions to stonewall you. She absorbed this. I'm his daughter. You're his only heir as far as the legal structure is concerned. If Kava had any documentation left with them contingent on your identity being established, how do we establish my identity? Carlo's already pulled the documentation, birth records, the legal paperwork your mother filed when you were born. Your father's name is on the original certificate. She listed him, whatever happened afterward. He paused. It's enough. She thought about her mother in the anteroom, about the question her mother had asked, complicated, and the answer she hadn't fully given. About the things her mother had kept from her, not out of cruelty, but out of the very human calculation that some truths protected the person who didn't know them. She knew, Mirella said. My mother, who he was. I think so, yes. She never told me. No. She was quiet for a moment. The weight of it was substantial, but it wasn't sharp. Not yet. That sharpness would come later, in a conversation that hadn't happened yet, in a kitchen somewhere that was hers, with her mother across the table and the difficult language of long-kept things between them. Right now it was just wait. The lawyers, she said. Where are they? Rome. Carlo can have a meeting arranged by tomorrow morning if you're willing. She nodded. Then that's what we do. She looked at him. And Moretti? Lucien's expression settled into something that was very still and very decided. Moretti declared publicly the port strikes, the abduction, the convoy. He put all of it in daylight. He can't undeclare. Which means every other organization in the region that has been watching him expand for 18 months now has a clear picture of what he is and what he costs. He paused. I've been making calls. There are people who want this resolved as much as I do. We're not moving alone. She understood what that meant without needing it spelled out. The specific regionalism of it. The way power organized itself in this part of the world. The agreements that sat underneath the conflicts like bedrock. The collective decision that someone had gone too far and needed to be removed from the equation. It wasn't clean. None of it was clean. But it was the mechanism available, and she was 4 days into understanding how the machinery worked, and she was not naive enough to wish for a different one. Okay, she said. Bianchi came back in with antibiotics and a look that communicated, without words, that his professional opinion was that his patient should be horizontal and that everyone else should be in another city. He gave Lucien the antibiotics. He looked at the wound one more time with the squinting assessment of a craftsman checking his work. He said, 2 weeks. Yes, Lucien said. Bianchi looked at Mirella. Make sure he takes the pills. I'll do my best, she said. Bianchi left again. Lucien looked at her with something that was very close to the not-quite smile she'd first seen in a kitchen at 2 a.m, and she looked back at him, and in the antiseptic quiet of the back room, the 4 days compressed, and then expanded. And somewhere inside that expansion was the specific knowledge of what it meant to have gone through something with a person. The particular bond of shared extremity that was neither simple nor uncomplicated, but was real in the way that only things tested against actual circumstances got to be real. She didn't say any of that, neither did he. She handed him his shirt. The conversation with her mother happened that evening in a room on the second floor of Lucien's building in the city, with Agatha's tea going cold on the table between them and the sounds of the organization below moving through the floor like a current neither of them commented on. Her mother talked for a long time. She talked in the way of someone who has been holding a story for decades and has finally reached the place where holding it costs more than telling it. She had met Renato Cava when she was 26. She had known what he was, or the edges of it, the outline of it, as much as a person could know from the outside of something like that. She had loved him in the specific way of someone who understood that the thing they loved was going to eventually exceed their capacity to contain it. When she'd found out she was pregnant, she had made a decision. She'd taken his name off everything she could take it off, kept it only on the documents the law required, moved to Cefalu, and built the life she could build with what she had. I was afraid, her mother said. Not as an apology, as a fact. not of him, of what followed him, of what you would become if you grew up inside it. Morella listened to all of it. She sat very still and listened, the way she'd sat very still through a lot of things this week. And when her mother finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did right." Her mother looked at her. "You did right," she said again. "You kept me out of it. You built something clean." She paused. "It found me anyway. But that's not your fault. That's not something you could have prevented by telling me earlier." Her mother reached across the table and put her hand over Morella's. Her hand was flower rough and warm and very familiar. They sat like that for a while without talking, the old language of two people who had raised each other as much as one had raised the other, the language that didn't require sentences. "This man," her mother said finally, carefully. "Yes," Morella said. Yes." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "He found your name before he found your father's. He protected you before he understood why you mattered strategically." It wasn't a question. Morella looked at her mother. "Yes." Her mother nodded once, slowly, the way she nodded when she had decided something and had no further comment to make on it. She picked up her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. The meeting in Rome happened 2 days later. Lucien's shoulder was treated and dressed, and he moved with the slightly careful quality of a man respecting a new constraint, which for him meant he moved at 90% of his normal velocity rather than stopping. Morella went with him. Carlo came. Her mother went to stay with a cousin in Cefalù under protection that Carlo had arranged so thoroughly that when Morella called to check on her that first morning, her mother reported that 2 very polite young men had repaired her garden gate without being asked, which she found both reassuring and slightly unnerving. Cava's lawyer was a woman in her late 60s named Dottoressa Farini, with offices in a building near the Pantheon that had been practicing law in some form for longer than anyone in the room had been alive. She received Morella with the contained attention of someone who had been waiting for this meeting for 4 years and had decided to wait for as long as necessary rather than initiate it, because initiating it would have constituted a decision about whose hands to put something into, and she hadn't known whose hands were the right ones. She looked at the documentation Carlo placed in front of her. She looked at Mirella. "He found you," she said. "He told me he would." "He sent a letter," Mirella said, 6 months before he died. "I didn't know who it was from." "He didn't sign it. He said he wouldn't. That if you didn't know who it was from, it couldn't be used against you." Dottoressa Farini folded her hands on the desk. "He also said that if you came here, it would mean you'd been told. And that if you'd been told and come anyway, you were the kind of person the trust was meant for." She gave Morella the documentation. It was exactly what Lucien had described. An architecture, a map, the specific coordinates of things Cava had built and hidden and tried to leave to the only person in his life he decided he trusted with them, which had been the daughter he'd never met, and whom, reading between the lines of what the lawyer told her over the next 2 hours, he had spent the last year of his life quietly and fruitlessly trying to find a way to know. She read all of it. Lucien sat beside her and read what she showed him and said nothing. Carlo made notes. Dottoressa Farini provided coffee and the precise professional support of someone who had been keeping this particular vigil for a long time and was relieved, in the measured way of her profession, to be putting it down. On the flight back to Palermo, Morella sat with the folder in her lap and looked at the clouds below the plane and thought about a man she had never known who had spent the last year of his life trying to leave her something, and about the fact that what he'd tried to leave her had instead brought Matteo Moretti into her life, and by extension had brought everything else, and about whether that was tragedy or something more ambiguous than tragedy. She decided it was more ambiguous. Most things were. Moretti was taken into custody 11 days later. Not by Lucien's people directly. The arrangement was more complex than that, the kind of complexity that was the regional equivalent of several large organizations deciding simultaneously that a problem needed institutional resolution rather than private one. The Italian Financial Crimes Authority, acting on documentation provided through channels that were technically anonymous but practically traceable to anyone who knew what to look for, executed a series of coordinated operations that dismantled the Moretti organization's financial infrastructure in a single morning. The criminal charges were broad and well evidenced. The evidence had been assembled by people who had been motivated to assemble it thoroughly. Moretti himself was arrested at his home outside Catania. The footage, which circulated briefly before being suppressed, showed him being walked to a vehicle in handcuffs with the expression of a man who had made a very long series of very careful calculations and had missed one. Luca was dealt with quietly, in the way that Lucien dealt with things that required him to hold two incompatible truths simultaneously. The truth that what Luca had done had endangered people and caused real damage, and the truth that what Luca had done had been done for his sister with nothing else available to him. The outcome was a separation, a severance, terms that were harder than forgiveness and less final than the alternative. Luca's sister was safe. Luca was somewhere else. Sergio's situation was more complex and took longer and was never fully simple, but Giada went back to school in Palermo and was met by her father outside the gate every afternoon that month without exception, which was what mattered most. The coastal villa was repaired. The gate had been damaged in the raid, and the north garden wall needed rebuilding, and two of the upstairs windows had been blown out in the crossfire, and all of it was put back over the following weeks by people who worked with the quiet thoroughness of people paid to restore things. Morella didn't go back to the restaurant. She went back to Palermo. She went back to her apartment, which was exactly as she'd left it on the evening she'd spun under the hanging lights, and a man in a dark corner booth had watched her and set something in motion that neither of them could have named at the time. The apartment was small and clean, and it smelled like itself. The specific smell of a life lived simply on a waitress's income, the coffee she made in the morning, the particular quality of light that came through her east window at 7 a.m. and hit the counter in a way she'd spent 2 years finding beautiful without ever saying so out loud. She stood in the middle of it for a long time. Then she opened the window and let the city in. She had money now. Or the beginning of it. The documentation Cava had left her representing assets that would take months to fully access and longer to understand, filtered through the kind of legal process that moved at its own pace, regardless of what had been paid for it in other currencies. She had technically more financial options than she'd had at any point in her life. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. It felt, in the early days, more like a responsibility than a resource, like something she was carrying rather than something she owned. She went to see her mother in Cefalù on a Tuesday, took the train, the way she always had. Her mother made lunch and the rosemary bread with sea salt pressed into the crust, the Sunday bread on a Tuesday, which was its own kind of statement. They ate at the small kitchen table and talked about things that were not the past month and also slowly, carefully, about the things that were. Her mother had questions she'd been holding since the car ride out of Palermo, and Mirella answered them as honestly as she could, which was honestly enough. At one point her mother said, "He came here, Lucien, the day after you went to Rome." Mirella looked up from her bread. "He came to the door. He didn't come inside. He said—" Her mother paused, the careful reconstruction of someone reporting a thing verbatim, because the words themselves mattered. "He said that whatever happened, you should know that the choice in the restaurant was not a calculation, that it was the first real thing he'd done in a long time." Her mother looked at her with the particular neutrality of a woman who has made up her mind but is choosing to let her daughter arrive at her own conclusions. "He left. He didn't wait for a response." Mirella sat with this for a while. Her coffee was getting cold. She let it. "He drove an hour to Cefalù to say that," she said finally, "and didn't wait for a response." Apparently, she looked at the table, at the bread her mother made, at the small kitchen with its familiar geography of worn tiles and hanging pans, and the photograph on the wall that was the only one she knew of her parents together. Her mother at 26 with the specific brightness of someone who hasn't yet learned the cost of certain things, and beside her a man whose face she'd been looking at all her life without knowing his name. She called Lucien from the train on the way back to Palermo. He answered on the second ring. "My mother told me you came to Cefalù," she said. A pause. "Yes." "You didn't wait for a response." It wasn't that kind of statement. She looked out the train window at the Sicilian coast going past, the particular gold of it in the late afternoon, the way the water caught the light and held it. The hills above the shore with their old stone buildings and their older olive groves and the whole long, complicated, beautiful, difficult history of the place moving past the window like something she'd been looking at all her life and was only now beginning to see clearly. "Come to the apartment tonight," she said. "I'll cook." A pause. "You cook." "I work in restaurants. Of course I cook." "What time?" 7. "Bring nothing. The shoulder gets a chair and doesn't lift anything." Something in the silence that followed had the quality of that not quite smile. She could hear it without seeing it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said back. She hung up and watched the coast go past and thought about a girl who had spun under hanging lights 3 weeks ago because the music started and her body answered before her brain could make it stop, and about the specific, unlikely, costly chain of events that had followed from that single unguarded moment of joy, and about what it meant that at the end of all of it, the gunfire, the running, the winery, the pharmacy, the steel table and the antiseptic smell, and the documents, and the arrest and the long, slow work of aftermath, she was on a train going home to cook dinner. It meant, she decided, that you couldn't predict what an unguarded moment would cost you, but you also couldn't predict what it would bring. She got home at 6. She had onions, tomatoes, a piece of good fish she'd bought at the Cephalou market that morning, and the rosemary her mother had pressed into her bag at the door, the way she always pressed things into bags at doors, because that was the language she spoke when words weren't quite enough. She cooked with the window open and the city coming in. The sound of it, the smell of it, the specific late evening quality of Palermo in the summer, the warmth that had weight to it, the voices from the street below mixing with the music from somewhere she couldn't identify. Something old and Sicilian and irresistible. Her feet were bare on the tile. At 7 minutes past 7, there was a knock at the door. She turned the heat down under the pan and walked to the door and opened it. Lucien stood in the corridor. His shoulder was still bandaged under his shirt. She could see the slight accommodation in how he held it. He looked like a man who had spent 11 days managing the aftermath of something significant and had arrived at the end of them at a door he didn't know the language for and was deciding in real time whether to learn it. He looked at her. She stepped back from the door. He came in. The apartment was small around him, the way it was small around everything large, but it contained him, and he stood in the middle of it and looked at the window with the city coming through it and the pan on the stove and the rosemary on the counter, and the specific lived-in intimacy of a life arranged around its own small sufficiencies. And something in his face did the thing it did when the surface gave way to whatever was under it, slowly, without drama, the way stone wears away. "Sit down," she said. "The shoulder gets the chair." He sat. He watched her cook. She didn't perform it. She just cooked, the way she'd cooked her whole adult life, with the focused economy of someone who had learned to make good things from limited materials and found a specific satisfaction in that skill that had nothing to do with audience. They ate at the small table with the window open. The food was good. She knew it was good. He ate with the attention of a man who was tasting something for the first time in a long time and was surprised to find that tasting still worked. After a while, he said, "What will you do with the money?" She considered it. "I don't know yet. Something that makes sense." She looked at him. "The villa, the coastal property, are you keeping it?" "It needs repairs." "I know. I was there when it needed the repairs." She watched his face. "I liked it. The olive grove. The way the water sounded at night." He was quiet for a moment. "It's been in the family for 40 years. I keep meaning to do something with it, and then things get complicated." "Things are always complicated with you." "Yes. Maybe this year they get less complicated." He looked at her. "Maybe," he said. In his voice was the specific weight of a man who knew the distance between maybe and yes and was, for the first time in some years, willing to sit inside the uncertainty of that distance, rather than resolving it prematurely in one direction or the other. She accepted that. It was enough. After dinner, she put on music. Not the tarantella, something slower, something that came from the radio station she kept on in the evenings when the apartment got too quiet. The old Italian songs her mother had always played on Sunday mornings, while the rosemary bread was in the oven. It filled the small apartment with something that had nothing to do with urgency or violence or the specific grammar of the past 3 weeks. Lucian sat in the chair with the shoulder that was healing and looked at her across the table, and she looked back, and somewhere in the space between them, the thing that had been building since a man in a dark corner booth had watched a girl spin under hanging lights. The thing that had survived gunfire and betrayal and revelation and the specific crucible of people tested past the point where performance is possible, was simply, quietly present. "I owe you a dance," she said. He looked at her. "At the restaurant," she said. "You watched. You never clapped." "I don't clap," he said. "That's terrible." "I was watching." Watching isn't clapping. Something happened to his face. The not-quite smile arrived fully this time. Actually arrived, no longer approximate, the real version of the thing she'd been seeing in outline for days. It changed him considerably. It made him look like someone who had once been young and was rediscovering, slowly and with appropriate caution, that some portion of that was still available. He stood. He held out his right hand. His left was still careful at his side. The shoulder's constraint respected with the discipline of a man who had learned that the body's limits were not negotiable even when everything else was. She looked at his hand. She took it. They moved together in the small apartment with the old music coming from the radio and the city coming through the open window, slow and unperformed, two people who had been through too much too fast and were finding, on the other side of it, that there was something worth the finding. He moved carefully, accommodating the shoulder, and she moved with him, and it was nothing like the tarantella. No performance, no audience, no hanging lights, just the specific, unhurried weight of two people choosing, in the quiet of an ordinary evening, to be present in the same place at the same time without anything demanding they be anywhere else. She rested her forehead against his jaw. His hand at the small of her back was still. Outside, Palermo continued its ancient, complicated life. The voices from the street, the music from somewhere, the smell of the sea coming in on the evening air, the last of the summer light going gold above the rooftops, and then slowly, gently letting go. Inside the small apartment, nothing was resolved in the grand sense. The organization still existed and would have to be dismantled piece by piece over years, not days. The money from Cava's estate would have to be navigated through legal processes that were slow and imperfect. Sergio was somewhere else trying to rebuild something from the materials available to him. Luca's sister was safe, and Luca was not, and that math was not clean and would not become clean. Lucien's shoulder would take 2 weeks to heal, and his history would take considerably longer and might never fully close. None of that was resolved, but Mirella Vale, 24 years old, daughter of a dead man whose name she'd only recently learned, stood barefoot on the tile of her own kitchen with her forehead against the jaw of a man who had covered her with his body before he knew her name, and felt for the first time since the music had started and her feet had answered that the unguarded moment had been worth it. She closed her eyes. She listened to the city. She stayed.